contracts simply because there's a whole lot to leases. I would like to go a little bit beyond the scope of a lease contract. I would like to start from the beginning and give you a little more background than just dealing with the process of writing a contract, because that will be putting the wagon in front of the horses, so to speak. The lease application process begins with the applications. But before we even get to the applications, we have something in the state of Texas that is called information about broker services that we have to present to our clients. Anybody? At the first substantial meeting with the clients. And so that's where it all starts, with the information about brokerage services. In Texas, we have something that is called the Texas Property Code. Now you can imagine in 2 hours I can barely describe the 16 pages of a lease contract, much less all of the documents associated with the lease contract, and on top of that, a 46-page document that is called the Texas Property Code, which guides us in our relationships and in the process of leasing any property. Now, I want you to take note of this. I want you to write down my email address, which is woodlandsbroker, altogether, @gmail.com. And if you promise to send me an email requesting a copy of the Texas Property Code, I will be happy to send you this PDF that you are watching here in front of you. This Texas Property Code part that covers, as you can see from the title, is Title 8, Chapter 92, everything that you will ever want to know about leases, you know, in landlord's rights, and tenants' rights, and obligations. And so I venture to say that very few agents in the state of Texas are actually intimately familiar with this so important document. In much of the questions that come up, in many of the problems that surface as a result of interacting with other agents in a lease application, in a lease contract preparation, stems from the fact that they have not read this document. I don't expect you to memorize it. I don't expect you to even know all the nuances of this document, but I do want you to know that it exists, for you to refer to it whenever in doubt about a part of the process. When a client sometimes puts you on the spot and asks you something specific about the how-to or what are my rights. So this is a great resource for you to go to. And if I just scroll rapidly through some of this, it explains even the terminology of the document. You know, things that you always wanted to know, but you were afraid to ask. And so everything, as I scroll through here, if you just read the titles of the paragraphs, you will see that it would answer a lot of questions about a lot of different issues that may surface in the process of having a tenant in the house. And if not in the preparation of the documents themselves, sometimes after the lease takes effect, and then one of your clients wants to know, where do I stand, or what do I do, how do I enforce something, what are my rights? And so all of this is detailed here in this document. Even many experienced agents are not aware of all of the items that are contained within this document that it is, after all, considered the law in the state of Texas. So before you go out there volunteering opinions about things that you think make common sense, be sure that you understand that there is a guidance, a document, a law that we're bound by. And if we are in violation of any of the articles within this document, guess what? It makes us individually liable for doing something that may be outside of the parameters of the law. So there is a process, there is a method to the madness, there are expectations from the state as to when something is enforceable and how to address the issues. When you go to an attorney to enforce some of the articles within this law, this is where the attorneys go to enforce it. So I'm not going to expand much more on that explanation. I just want you to know that it's extremely important that you recognize that there is a very lengthy document that you may use as a resource at any time. I think it would be a great idea, not just to have it on your computer, maybe print it and keep it in your files. I mean, I know that it's kind of a dinosaur term, printing something, but I think it's easier to refer to something sometimes that you have nearby in the process of filling out an application, in the process of enforcing, in the process of explaining something to your clients, than having to go into a computer. In fact, because I will be sending you this in the format of a PDF, if you engage a landlord, if you engage a tenant, sometimes it may be useful for them to know what it is that they're bounded by. Now remember this, if you share this document with a client, I think it will be somewhat important that you go through the process of reading it first, not memorizing it, because even most attorneys don't remember what's all in there, but it's a great point of reference. Also remember that this is not a static document. This is something that changes from time to time. And as you can see from the different paragraphs, it has a reference to the legislative session in which changes take place. Okay? And there are different acts that are enacted at different times during the legislature process. So do pay attention to keeping the most updated document. This document, it's easily acquired simply by going to the TREC website. You can even Google it. Texas legislature has the most recent version as well. So does anybody have any questions about the act and the things that we're guided by? Are we all okay with that? I just want to put it in the right context, okay? So we're going to move away from this document, and now we're going to get into other parts of the process of doing a lease. The first document that you will have in front of you pertains to the broker, information about broker services, which is required from us anytime we engage a client, whether it's a landlord or a tenant, and we make clear as to who we represent in the process of helping them. Remember, there are times when we may be engaged in representing a client with a property that is listed by another agent from RE/MAX, the Woodlands and Spring. And so in that case, you will become, or I will become, as a broker, the intermediary for that transaction, and then therefore there will be an intermediary form that is later in your document that will be necessary. But this is so that you know that anytime you engage into a lease where there is another agent that is representing the landlord or the tenant, depending on what role you're playing, an intermediary relationship form is required. I want you to know this. There are 3 offices that are in the Woodlands under the RE/MAX flag. RE/MAX, the mothership, this is us here. Then we have RE/MAX, the Woodlands and Spring Mike Cedars office. It is not called Mike Cedars office, but that's, you know, who owns it. But there are several agents in Mike Cedars office. And I want you to keep in mind that it could be a listing from that office. And then we have RE/MAX Carlton Woods, which is also part of our company. And there are about 5 agents in that office. But if you are engaging in doing a lease with either one of those 2 offices or an agent who is associated with this office, then an intermediary relationship notice is required. Well, I didn't mean to do that. Then the next item, as you would anticipate, that is required, once a listing hits on the MLS, I don't want to assume that you would always be representing the tenant, because there will be instances in where you will have an opportunity to list a lease in order to attract tenants. In that case, you will be representing the landlord, okay? Either way, one of the first steps after the information about brokerage services that takes place is completing a residential lease application. This is a very important part of the process. For a second, I'm going to assume that you're representing the tenants. If you are representing the tenants, this is probably about 5 pages or so into the little package, 4 pages into the package that I just, from the beginning, the package that I just put together. This, by the way, this package is a compilation of all the documents that I felt that you may be in need to use. So it is titled Residential Lease Application. Does everybody find it? Okay? Okay. So this is an extremely important document because it is very unlikely that you will actually accomplish what you set out to do without going through this process of a residential lease application. This is for your clients to fill out. And if you read part of the title, you see that each occupant and co-applicant 18 years or older must submit a separate application. And that is exactly what it means. If anyone is going to be residing or they're going to be co-applicants in the process, they are bound to complete this form. This form is a several parts form. I'm not going to get too much into the details of this form, but if you are representing a tenant, as I said, I'm going to assume that for a second, it may be in your best interest to have your client, your prospect tenant, to complete this application before you embark in the process of identifying a property. And in saying that, you may be well advised not to include the property address on the very first application, because that will save you a lot of time and aggravation. What I typically would do, if I meet a tenant, I would ask, I know that there are certain things required from a tenant by a landlord. One of the things that I would do, I will do a needs analysis trying to determine what it is that this prospect tenants are looking for, And I will inform them that there are going to be certain documents that are going to be required no matter who we actually apply with for whatever property. At that point in time, I will request that they produce a driver's license, and I will secure it just like they do at the title company for the purposes of making a copy. Okay? And then I will ask him to start completing the application from the beginning. At some point in time after they complete the application, I would also ask him to produce a couple of copies or a copy of a couple of the last pay stubs from their employment, because that is going to be added documentation that you will be sending. I would also ask if they have a current copy of their credit report that states all three scores from the three companies, Experian, Equifax, and the other one. And if they do, ask them to produce a copy for you. If they do not have one, tell them that this is typically expected by a landlord and that you will have to produce one. Also inform them that in the application process for any property that they choose to request, that there will be an application fee that is expected from each of the adults applying. Now, the question is going to come up, do I have to pay the fee whether they approve me or not? And the answer typically is yes. Sometimes the landlord representatives do not take the checks unless they approve them, but that's not always the case. And I will explain to you why. You have to understand that in the process of evaluating an applicant or multiple applicants for any lease, any property, they have to go through the process of pulling credit reports, sometimes doing background investigation, sexual offenders, criminal background, what have you. And that is not a free process. So if you're going to engage a lender, if you're going to engage a landlord in the process of determining whether or not they're going to accept you, expect that you will pay a fee per individual applying. Sometimes it's $25, sometimes it's $35, sometimes it's $50 per person. So keep that in mind. How do you determine that? When you go into the MLS and you look at the MLS printout or the MLS sheet on the screen, you will see that the listing agent typically produces the amount that is expected to be produced by the applicant, by the prospect tenant. Make sure that all of the information on this application is complete. Like I said earlier, you may want to skip the property address, and you may want to skip the field where it says monthly rent and the security deposit, because the reality is that each property will have a different monthly rent amount and a different security deposit amount. You may put yourself as a real estate agent, tell them to leave that field blank, and tell them to leave the other check boxes, newspaper, sign, internet, or other, and to begin the process of filling the application where the applicant's name, first, middle, last, and moving forward. Now, you understand that if each applicant for this property is going to be responsible for completing an application, a lot of this information is going to be redundant across the board for each one of the applicants. But each applicant, nevertheless, must complete. You cannot copy one application and then move on to complete, because obviously the other persons are going to be different. It's going to be different for the applicant, and the relationships individually are going to be different as well. So as you move through this 4-page document, make sure that every field is appropriately completed per the questions. And once you get to the last page, you will see that this is really more for the applicant to give authorization for the landlord to perform an investigation, credit report, criminal background, etc. So at the bottom of this, there is an applicant's signature. And you will see that you could not accomplish replication of this form by simply copying it, because every applicant signature will be different. Any questions on the application process? Yes, Frank?
You said you would collect the application from each person who will be living in the home who's 18 and older, and also ask them for a credit report with a score from all 3 agencies. Do you need that credit report on all applicants also? So if there's a 19-year-old living in the home, do they need a credit report?
They typically would. However, I think most landlords understand the sons and daughters of the primary applicants may not necessarily have a credit report at that point in time. I think most landlords would focus on pulling credit reports from the primary applicants, not the children. Although sometimes you may run into a situation in where you have multiple applicants of younger age, people that may be in college, that want to apply, let's say, to rent a townhouse or a small single-family home. And that becomes a little more cumbersome for the landlord to try to evaluate. Most landlords will not be warm and fuzzy about taking multiple applicants of 19, 20 years of age with very limited credit reports and not really understanding what's going to happen if one of the roommates leave. So as you embark in that process, if you have applicants of a younger age, remind them that not everyone really is receptive to that kind of situation. But it is your responsibility to treat them because they are adults, and in equal housing laws, we are bound to represent them fairly under the law. We have to embark in the process. Just set the expectations correctly. I think that no matter what you're involved with in real estate, if you have clients, it's extremely important that you set the correct expectations for the clients that you're dealing with. I think if anything is going to go wrong, it's typically because people have different understandings of how things should work. So feeling comfortable with the process and taking control of the process is extremely important to make it a smooth transaction all the way through from the very beginning. I'm going to close this. Did I answer your question, Frank?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
The check that they're making out for their application, is that going to be usually made out to the specific place? So that's like, you know.
It's a great question. Sometimes it's a different process depending on whether or not the listing agent has chosen for the landlord to work with a third-party company. So sometimes there are companies like GoForRent.com and others. I'm not trying to push them. I just simply, that one came to mind. That they do the evaluation process for the landlords. Sometimes you're going to end up representing landlords. And let me tell you, it's a great relief for you as a listing agent of properties that are going to be for lease, perhaps to delegate, in other words, set the expectations correctly for your landlord in that you may want to engage a third-party processing firm to do the background investigation and the credit report. And I tell you why. Because it's a representative of the landlord. The landlord really doesn't understand what the process is. The only thing they want is a highly qualified tenant to come to them and to pay rent on time without destroying the property, without discovering 2 or 3 months into the rent process that they have a sexual offender living in their home, or they have someone who cannot pay in time. So it's a great liability to you to absorb the responsibility of evaluating the tenant, you know. So because the landlord is going to turn to you when they ask you, okay, you bring the application, and they're going to say, well, what do you think about these people? And sometimes you have no clue who these people are, because the reality is you just received about 6 hours earlier a call from a tenant's representative asking you, do you have anything working on this property? Okay? And you're going to say, probably, no, I don't have anyone yet. And so the next thing you're going to see is documents that are going to look just like this, residential lease application, and you're going to have to read it, and then they're going to ask your opinion from it. You have no checks. You've never met these people, you know, and a lot of times you don't even realize whether or not these people have pets unless you read the application. Because sometimes you may have a listing that says no pets, but guess what? When you get an application, you find out that they got a little chihuahua, or worse, you know, a huge dog that is clearly identified on the listing as no pets. Most of the leases that you will find is case by case on the pets, but you have to read the application, and that's my point. Yes?
Do you have a couple companies that you recommend to send to these landlords that you've had good success with?
No. The answer is no. There are companies out there. We don't take a position as to who we recommend or not. I can tell you of one that I remember clearly is GoForRent.com. There are others. Just be sure you check them out and you understand what it is that they do and what it is that they don't. But if you just locally or even nationally, you Google you know, tenant representation, you know, investigation, or whatever the terminology would be, you will find a half a dozen companies that are very reputable, but check them out. I think the most important part if you're representing a landlord is that you understand what it is that the third-party company does and does not do. One of the things that I like to do when I engage a third-party company to take the responsibility of processing this is those companies that actually allow the tenants to go online to make payment for the process of evaluating, you know, background checks, credit reports. In other words, you never have to touch the tenant's money and get into the right party. So, yes.
And that's another thing, they'll never take a personal check.
Correct. Yeah, it's a good point. In our office, understand that we don't deal with cash and we don't deal with personal checks. So if we are taking monies from tenants to pass on to representatives from other companies, be sure that you only accept cashier's checks and or money orders, okay? Never allow a tenant to hand you $70 in cash, because we have no way of processing that through the office. And guess what? It does have to be processed through the office. So it is very important that you do require either a cashier's check or a money order. At that point in time, you may not even know who to write this cashier's check to or money order. So you may have to engage in the process of sending the application first. It's pretty informal, usually, and that you send the applications in, and and then you'll get some indication from the landlords as to how to address the issue of payment and whether to deliver it to or not. But going back to my point, it is very convenient for us to refer our clients to a third-party company, because all they have to do is get online, perhaps put a credit card number there, and then the third-party company, once they receive payment, they produce the reports and they send them to the agents who are going to be evaluating this. Any other questions on the application?
If you do an application to get the fee and everything, and for example, it has no pets and then they ended up having a pet and they find another house, would they have to do another application fee, or would they be able to use that same or different?
No, every application fee is pertinent to the property that you are applying for. In other words, there are different landlords. The fee is not for us. The fee is for the representatives of the landlord or the companies that they work with. Okay? So what may be good for one landlord may not necessarily be accepted by another landlord that they don't know, because everybody has different criteria for acceptance. Sometimes there are investors who own properties and they're willing to take a lower credit score than perhaps an individual or a couple of owners who have higher expectations from their tenants. Yes?
Is the landlord only obligated to take one application at a time with one fee, and then, like, say there were 10 applicants in each?
Great question. So the answer is no. There is no obligation for a landlord to take any one application at a time. However, it is the obligation of the landlord or the landlord's representative to respond. As you can see, that there is a place to indicate when this was received on, what date and what time. And then later in the application, there is a place to actually respond. If I can find it. I'm going to move through here so it's a little bit slower. Okay. So on page 304, the landlord right here will indicate whether the application was approved or not approved and the reason for disapproval. This could be very touchy, so you have to be sure that the landlord actually indicates, and the landlord has to do this, or you as a representative of the landlord has to do it for him. But nevertheless, whoever fills that out assumes the responsibility for the response. So in the case that you have multiple tenants applying for the same property, it's no different that a homeowner who is selling a property and receives multiple offers. The landlord or the homeowner has to evaluate the applications, their own merits, and there can only be one person that can be approved. Sometimes you may receive 4 applications and they are rejected, depending on what the credit scores are, depending on what the background of the people. And the landlord can actually reject for just about any reason, any legal reason. They cannot make decisions based on race, creed, gender, and familiar status and all that. So equal housing will actually guide us as to what they can and cannot do. They cannot simply say, no, I don't want X ethnicity on my property. It's just simply illegal, and you should guide your landlords, that, okay, you're going to have a valid reason, and typically those valid reasons are financial, in nature, or, they do not accept someone because of criminal background or what have you. They may not meet the right scores that they expect, and that needs to be annotated on here. So every time that you have an application, you have a response that has to be documented, and you should maintain the reasons why. Now let me say something that is extremely important to us, to me as a broker, to us as a brokerage, to you as an individual. We have a privacy policy in this office. You have to understand that the moment you get your hands on this particular document, you become responsible for information that is very, very personal, and you assume responsibility now for a whole lot of information that could be compromised at some point in time in the process. And as you can see, just in this part alone, right here, you have information like Social Security numbers, driver's license number, date of birth, a whole lot of personal information that could be compromised at some point, and these people could become the victims of identity theft. So it is incredibly important that once you are done with the processing of this information,